If I could please have your attention, I'd like to introduce the members of our next panel. The title of the panel is Veterans and the Forever War, Recent Vets on Military Reform and U.S. Foreign Policy. Gil Barndollar served as an infantry officer in the United States Marine Corps. He deployed twice to Afghanistan as a light armored reconnaissance platoon commander and as a combat advisor with the Georgian Army. He currently serves as Director of Middle East Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Major John Q. Bolton is an active duty Army officer currently serving as Executive Officer for the 2nd Battalion, 25th Aviation Regiment based at Wheeler Army Airfield, Hawaii. A 2005 West Point graduate, he served several tours of combat in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Daniel Davis retired as a lieutenant colonel after 21 years in the U.S. Army, including 4 combat deployments between Desert Storm and Afghanistan. He is currently a foreign policy and national security advisor for defense priorities and a member of the Center for Defense Information Military Advisory Board. Dan Grazier is a former Marine Corps captain who served combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan during the War on Terror. He is now a fellow at the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. Jeff Groom served in the Marines for 9 years as an officer and naval aviator, retiring in 2018. He is the author of the satirical memoir, American Cobra Pilot, A Marine Remembers a Dog and Pony Show. And our moderator, retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson, teaches government and public policy at William & Mary. Previously, he served as Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff and Associate Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff under Ambassador Richard N. Haas. He served in the U.S. Army for 31 years. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Wonder how you get that to work. Is it working? Yeah, it is. No green light. Thank you all for being here. I'm sure you've heard that a number of times already. I thank you again. Just in the way of making some preliminary remarks about what I think is central to this panel's discussion, Major General Dennis Leitch and I co-founded something called the All Volunteer Force Forum several years ago, and we've had symposia, conferences all across the country, and our attempt is to get a debate going amongst the American people about, more or less, the condition of the all-volunteer force and the country with respect to the force. Dennis likes to say that the American people see that force through a lens of fear, apathy, ignorance, and guilt. You're going to hear, I think, some of that this morning. Dennis also likes to think and say, as do I and the other members of the forum, that the all-volunteer force has become, in its institutional fabric, unethical, unsustainable, physically and ethically, and that needs to be explored, and it isn't being explored. In fact, what we're finding on the Hill, where you would think this conversation would at least nascently be going on, a complete ineptitude with regard to it, and a reluctance to touch this, as some will call it, third, fourth rail of politics. That is to say, you don't mess with it, except, they'll all admit, to include women in any form of conscription that we might in the future have or envision. I'd like to start this panel with Gil Barndollar, whom I know probably as well as anyone on this panel, Marine. I won't say former because Marines are never former, or ex, and an individual who is becoming known throughout the national security community, not just for his views on the armed forces, but other wider, more comprehensive views too. Gil has made some remarks that sort of parallel ones we've heard at the forum, that U.S. troops are not ambassadors. They're not the entity that should be replacing diplomacy or the State Department or USAID or whatever. I'd like to have him start the panel, if he's willing, with an elaboration of why he says that.
Thank you, Larry. I think part of this is we've got a peculiar trait as Americans where if we believe if we say something over and over again, it becomes true. I'm sure we can all think of countless examples of that, and I think that applies in spades in the military. And, you know, I don't have a pull quote at the ready, but you can find politicians, government appointees, generals talking about how our fighting men and women are the finest ambassadors for America. That, to me, is wildly off base, and if we actually talk ourselves into believing that, we are putting ourselves in this continuing cycle of militarizing foreign policy, even worse than it has been for the last, 30, 40, 50 years. The kind of people that really are, and they are, almost all men, few exceptions nowadays, but the kind of guys that are where the rubber meets the road in what General Mattis likes calling the last 600 meters of American foreign policy are 19-year-olds with rifles. They are, and I don't, I think the over-valorization and celebration of the military is unhealthy, and we could have a whole discussion about that. But by and large, they are great kids, great men. But they're out there at the front lines. They're not trained or selected or prepared to be ambassadors for America. They're there to defeat this country's enemies. When we put them in a position of nation building or whatever our current euphemism is for that, we're doing them a disservice, and we're not going to achieve our aims. So when you take 19-year-olds, primarily 19, 20-year-olds that run through a wall for you, put them in a foreign country, usually these days a tribalized, rural Muslim environment, and ask them to be ambassadors, one, that's not going to happen, and two, you're compromising. If you're really going to try to make that work, again, I don't think you'll do that, but you try to make that work, you're going to compromise the lethality of that force to do what it's supposed to do, which is to actually win wars that that matter for this nation. So.
Thanks, Gil. I just was looking at the program here, and I noted that they made a mistake and said a former Marine for Dan. Got to change that.
Take a few extras.
Major Bolton is still on active duty, as I understand it. Army officer, as he introduced himself. He has taken a particular phrase that Americans like to use a lot that I have some real problems with myself, and could relate to you why I have some of those problems, but I would like him to talk about what it means to a veteran to hear Americans. Remember what Dennis said about apathy, fear, guilt, and ignorance, the G word. What does thank you for your service mean to you?
Thank you, sir. First, as an active duty officer, I have to say that my comments are my personal opinions and not representative of the agency. So I think it's pretty common. All right, thank you. So most people on active duty, if you get an honest opinion, when they hear thank you for your service, they cringe. And the reason is the people saying it are individually earnest and well-meaning. But on the macro level, it's indicative of a wholly anti-Republican sentiment that is antithetical to what American citizenship means. And the problem is, thank you for your service has become a crutch by which we honor the military without understanding it in the least. And so when the global war on terror launched, we were told, the citizens were told to keep spending money, everything is normal, and the military is going to go do this fighting for you. Well, if it's a global war and it's an existential threat, that requires a mobilization, but we didn't do that. And no matter how well our troops perform, their sacrifice is irrelevant if it's not in service of something that suits the nation's ends. And it's fundamentally tragic, the situation we're in, where we give the military platitudes, we honor people. I'm grateful to get first on the Delta flight that I came here on. But it's irrelevant in the course of, it's fundamentally not a conversation about what the military does, how we spend our money. It's a platitude given in lieu of engagement, and it's antithetical to citizenship. And it makes most service members cringe even acknowledging that people saying it are being fundamentally earnest and honest about it. The problem is, if our wars are worth fighting, they're worth the nation fighting. Otherwise, it's immoral to do what we've done to our men and women over the last 15 years. To put them in And I think on the macro level, junior soldiers appreciate the sentiment. For senior non-commissioned officers, and particularly commissioned officers, they're cynical about the situation they're in, because none of them believe that these things have an end other than spending money, arguably training our forces, but there are better ways to train our forces than killing other people in areas of the world that are A, hostile to our ends, B, inimical to our way of government, and C, fundamentally eroding our consensus at home. And thank you for your service is the encapsulation of that entire problem, which is why I've written about and why so many of my generation have such a cynical view of it.
I got to tell a story here. Walter Reed, National Military Medical Center, the Air Force's only triple amputee. I'm sitting at a table with him in that rather nice lobby that they now have there. And the last thing I expected was him, when I bought him a cup of coffee, to smile at me. I said, "Joe, something amuses you?" And he said, "Yes, it does. I just came from my room." A congressional delegation came in to see me, 7 of them. And they walked into the room, and I immediately became angry because I knew exactly what was going to happen, and it did. They began to thank me for my service, the first thing they said. So I cut them off in mid-sentence, and I said, "Don't thank me for my service. I'm conflicted over that. Thank me for my sacrifice. You can plainly see that." That story made it for me. Dan Davis is another soldier, and I met him vicariously through his writings. Very impressed with what he has been saying, particularly about his own experience. Dan has talked about unwinnable wars, unwinnable wars like those in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, Iran, if it's being contemplated seriously, and so forth. So, Dan, would you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that there's a really big misunderstanding about what it means to win. We use that phrase all the time. Every president says, we're going to win in wherever, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, wherever they talk about going. But we need to understand what that actually means, especially in military terms. So to win, involves, an understanding of the military part of armed force. I mean, as John said a second ago, we're trained to kill people and break things. I mean, that's what we're designed to do. We're not designed to be ambassadors. We're designed to win America's wars. And so to win, what does that mean? If you send the military out there, von Clausewitz is still relevant today. And wars are the continuation of politics by other means. And so what that means is that if you're going to send the military in somewhere, it's got to have an achievable political end, i.e., you're going to use this force to attain some kind of political end that's beneficial to the United States. Just in concept, that's what it means. So if you're going to win something, it doesn't just mean, okay, we're going to go and take Berlin, and so we've won the war because we took this tactical objective. That's why you've seen over the last 17 years, practically everywhere we've ever been, every conflict we've had, and I'm talking about at the tactical level, I doubt that there's a single one that we've lost. So we're like 100-0 on winning the tactical fights, and we're 0 for everything on winning the political fight. So you have to ask the question, why do we want to keep sending American armed forces, men and women to die, to be in hospital rooms like what Larry saw a second ago, like happens every day, like's happening across town, for a battle that we can't win? There is no military solution for a political problem in Afghanistan. Definitely not one for Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Atoll, everywhere you want to go, especially Yemen. There is no military solution there. You can't defeat somebody and change their political views and make them want to reconcile because you kill enough of them. We have absolutely proven that in spades, that it doesn't matter how many people you kill, there's always replacements. And of course, you have the situation to where the more you kill, the more you create, because they're going to just keep going. I mean, we've seen it throughout history. increasing the level of pain and death and destruction with bombs or direct kinetic effect almost always hardens the other side. It almost never causes them to capitulate. And we have definitely not seen any of that in the last 17 years. So as a man who's been out there to fight sometimes, and all my brothers who've been there, and brothers and sisters and everybody who's out there right now, I mean, my heart bleeds for them, because it kills me to see that their lives almost don't even matter. This whole thing about, thank you for your service, masks what really is going on out there. And when you have all these surviving family members, these sons, these daughters, wives, husbands, it's extremely painful, and that part never gets seen by the public. If the public saw more about what the cost was to these unwinnable wars, saying, I appreciate your sacrifice might mean a little bit more, and then they might be a lot less willing to support something that's not even in our national interest. And that's really the most important thing to get out of this, aside from the human cost, is that we're applying military force to things that aren't even in the national interest. Our security is not put at risk in Syria right now. Those troops there do not do anything to help America. And you can certainly say the case that as weak as Iran is, they don't pose this existential threat that, oh my God, we have to go and be ready to fight wars with them all the time. And almost across the board, you can say that. So I would like to see a case where we actually value the lives of the men and women we send out there, and we don't send the military to fight wars that can't be won.
Just a quick add-on. The problem with the thank you for your service and this disconnect is the purpose of war. And so the public honors heroism and sacrifice abstractly, but the purpose of war isn't heroism. The purpose of war is to win, to suit a political end that ultimately meets the nation's objectives. And I can't think of a single deployment that U.S. forces are doing right now, no matter the number, scale, scope, size, whatever, that is doing that. They're fighting to fight. And war is a machine that will continue its own activities unless objectively stopped through an external force. It will always continue. You cannot control it, nor can you predict it. And that's true today as it was in 1826 when Clausewitz published it, like Dan said. Thank you.
Thank you. Just adding to that, if you haven't seen the YouTube hour-long or so interview of C.J. Chivers, who himself was a Marine or a soldier? A Marine, yeah. Writes for the New York Times Magazine and Esquire now. It's a riveting thing done at the Modern Institute for Study of War at West Point, which is right now a cauldron of objectivity and objection, as you might well imagine. He made a remark in that interview with the colonel who heads the Institute, who himself is a hardcore soldier, really hardcore soldier, but you can see CJ getting through to him and through to the audience as they deliver this monologue back and forth. And CJ says, here's a Marine in Afghanistan, and he's out on his th patrol, and he asked the question, and CJ was there when he asked the question, who the hell is the architect of this shit? Now, this is not a gunny sergeant. This is just your average infantryman. All Marine or infantryman, but this is just your average infantryman, Army, Marine, or whatever. And he has enough clarity of vision to understand the fundamental question about Afghanistan. Dan Grazier, also a Marine. We sort of packed this panel with Marines. That's okay with me. Has talked about U.S. forces not being organized or equipped properly for these kinds of wars. And he's also talked about, and this is a very, very in need of exploration issue with regard to war and the empire, which we certainly are today, and its utilization of the military instruments so frequently. The inability of the American people to accept the casualties that ought to be associated with winnable wars, or even unwinnable wars in the sense that they might be in our interest and they involve counterinsurgency. So, Dan, would you speak about that?
So I always like telling the story of when I first got to Iraq. I was a newly promoted first lieutenant. I was in command of a tank platoon, 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, 2nd Tank Battalion. We get to Fallujah in April of 2007, and I find myself with 4 tanks and working with a number of units in and around the city. And we were going out with a mission to try to pacify a population, and I had a tank platoon to do that with. So it didn't take me too long to work this out, that there was a big mismatch between the tools that I had available and the job that I needed to perform. And when you extrapolate that out, you realize that we have a military that, at least on paper, is geared and organized towards great state warfare against near-peer enemies like Russia and China. And then we send it out to pacify populations in the far corners of the world. And so it's this big fundamental problem that we have. Our military is essentially, it is a big square peg that's about 4 feet on each side, and we're trying to fit it in a hole that's the size of a pencil. And it doesn't work at all. And so I think we really need to address that mismatch. We need to either figure out that we don't have the military capacity to perform these kind of missions, and so maybe we shouldn't go out and try to do them in this way. Or we need to fundamentally reshape the military in the way that we purchase equipment, the way that we organize the forces. Either way, it's really difficult because, first off, there's a lot more money in preparing for a war against Russia or China than there is in preparing for a counterinsurgency campaign. So it becomes a very difficult calculus. And the other point about the realities of counterinsurgency warfare. So I'm a military historian, and I can tell you that there are very few successful counterinsurgency campaigns. And the ones that are successful, the reality of this is that you have to be willing to accept more casualties than you inflict in order to win a counterinsurgency campaign. So one of the most successful ones ever is the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland. And the United Kingdom largely won that conflict because they accepted more casualties than they inflicted on the Irish. And I don't know that the American people are willing to do that in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I know that personally, when I really saw what was going on in Iraq, I kind of made a secret vow to my Marines that I was going to do everything I could to bring them home, because I didn't see anything over there that was worth any of their lives.
Thanks. Jeff Groom is our last Marine, but he's got a special qualification. He's a naval aviator. I identify with that. I was an Army aviator, helicopter. So he has talked a lot about readiness and the crisis that interminable war has produced with regard to that readiness. We might even take into account, for example, a recent memorandum from Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis to the Air Force fighter community, telling them to get up to 80% operational readiness rate within a year. Now, Jim is not stupid. I know he knows those commanders beneath him will lie, because there is no way you are going to get an F-35, F-22, and other fighter aircraft community, those two planes alone taking in excess of 10 or 11 hours of maintenance for every flight hour they produce. You're never going to get to 80% ORR. So what are they going to do? They're going to lie. I know, I lied. That's how you do it, and that's how you survive. It's not something that the Secretary of Defense, though, should be issuing. So talk about military readiness and also the civil-military divide. I understand. Yeah.
Sir, thank you. So for the readiness crisis, you see a lot in the news these days. You know, the military's in a readiness crisis. So what does that mean to the layperson? What is readiness? So the way I describe readiness to the layperson is you're holding a quantifiable level of proficiency in a certain mission over the course of time. So right now, our readiness is like a sine wave. Like we get good, and then we suck, we get good, and then we suck. True readiness should be holding it as long as possible, which is a very, very hard thing to do. So the analogy I could use is like a football team. During the week, you have to practice to play under the lights. And my focus was on aviation, but there's a couple other examples I'll give, but mainly it'll be focused on aviation. And so the military has quantifiable ways that they report readiness. So every month, the Marine Corps has what's called the DER system, and they input basically, this is a squadron. We rate 30 helicopters. We only have 20 on hand, and of those 20, only 10 can fly. How many maintainers do we rate? How many maintainers are on hand? Those type of things. So all these things are fed into computers, and every month they're reported to higher. So when you hear that we have a readiness crisis, what they're really saying is the quantifiable numbers that show how well we are prepared to do our missions are bad. That's not in dispute. And we're starting to see the consequences of that. I mean, this last year, more aviators died in non-combat mishaps than people died in Afghanistan in the war. I mean, it's been in the news pretty hard lately of these aviation mishaps. People are like, what are going on? They're bringing in generals, aviators to grill them about like, what's going on with, aviation readiness? So I've kind of broken down like the causes of that and like what we can do. So the biggest one that everyone probably knows are just the wars. So after 17 years of war, our equipment's been ridden hard and put away wet, so that hurts readiness. Marine F-18 squadrons, the F-18 was never meant to loiter for 3 and 4 hours on station time over Iraq and Afghanistan, tanking and dropping bombs. It was meant to dynamically maneuver, shoot down other aircraft, and then land. So we've overflown these airframes, just that airframe in particular. There's other ones too. We've overflown them past their service life, so those squadrons are decimated. And then the next piece of it is, the Marine Corps thought that they were going to have the F-35 on time, which they didn't. Dan has written extensively on the F-35 program. It's 12 years behind schedule, and at this point in the lifespan of the military-industrial complex, they now have the upper hand. Lockheed Martin spread the F-35 over 45 different U.S. states. So there's zero will to cut the monster because it means, Arkansas is not going to build the wheel or Texas isn't going to build the engine. So no one will cut the thing, and it's too big to fail at this point. So now the military is now supporting the procurement system instead of the other way around. That's one example. There's many others as well. And the biggest point I'd like to talk about with the readiness crisis is something that kind of gets lost in the big picture, but it's the idea that we need to size our military to fight 2 major regional conflicts simultaneously. And so this idea came about after the end of the Cold War. We had this massive capacity to fight the Russians, which was a necessary thing. But after the Cold War ended, that capacity wasn't just going to go away. It wasn't like closing a seasonal Halloween store. It was like there was a lot more money at risk to shut down this system. And so we came up with this idea that we need to just size the military to fight 2 big wars at the same time. And that's not a strategy really, because a strategy implies that you have an opponent. So when you train in football, you're training for another team, the way their defense plays, et cetera. Since we don't have an opponent technically, we just create this capacity that will, in theory, deter other countries from fighting us. And so what this looks like on paper, it means that the Marine Corps, which is the smallest service of all the services, has more combat aircraft than Great Britain, who is no slouch in terms of defense spending or how many aircraft they have. And as of December 2016, in a Heritage report, only 40% of those aircraft were in flyable condition. So, and that's just the Marine Corps. And the other services are plagued by a similar thing. So the Army needs apparently 58 brigade combat teams of 4,500 soldiers apiece. And as of recent, only 3 of those are considered ready for combat. And so before I get into the how can we solve this, a lot of people would seem to think that overmatch matters. And Trump's national security strategy release said we need to retain overmatch. We need to rebuild our military to scale it to deter people and then fight and win if we have to. And while that seems correct on paper, and it can be true on paper, the idea that who has the most and who has the best equipment and the most equipment will win is no longer true. And in May of 1940, France had more tanks, they had better tanks, they had more soldiers, they were playing defense, and they had 9 months to prepare. Who won? Germany did in 43 days. Why? Because they had ideas that were revolutionary, maneuver warfare. They weren't fighting tooth and nail, they were fighting through gaps. That's a whole nother argument, and it's a massive argument that needs to be had that no one really will have. But the dangerous thing now is that there is zero congressional will or political will to scale down the military. The average person sees these problems and says, well, why don't we just make the military smaller and spend the same amount of money, and then we can raise readiness to where it needs to be. But there's zero political will to do that, because that would mean less tanks from the Lima plant in Ohio. That would mean less F-35s. So there's zero will to do any of those things. And so we have a situation where we just don't have enough bread to feed all the mouths. We have over 800 bases across the world that we spend about $70 billion on a year to upkeep. And the big bad Russians have 8 bases outside their borders. And then about 40% of our budget goes to pay and benefits before we ever buy a bullet or a bomb. And so something has to give. The way that our budget is trending and the way the readiness rates are trending, we can't have a lethal military and then also fund the empire. We either have to have a paper tiger military like we have now that is underfunded and won't be funded in the future as presidents change, as the House changes. We don't have a long-term strategy for making the military ready. So that's my perspective. And on the civilian-military divide, just a quick story. I told Dan this story as well. I did a podcast with him for Pogo, but I was leaving the gym one morning in San Diego when I was learning to fly the Cobra, and a guy was following. This is a civilian gym. A guy was following me out, and he said, "Hey, are you in the Marines?" I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, welcome home." And I said, "Well, why? This guy's just being genuine. Like he thinks I deployed. I'll give him the benefit of that. Well, I haven't deployed yet. I'm still learning." And he kind of like stopped for a second, then he goes, "Well, you still stood on a wall with a gun, didn't you?" And I said, "Well, did you not hear what I just said? I haven't deployed yet." And that made me realize that what's happening in America with the civilian-military divide it's a case of cognitive dissonance. It's that I took that guy's ability to support the troops away. He hasn't been able to support the troops. He hasn't had to pay taxes. His sons or daughters haven't been offered. Industry hasn't been retooled. Nothing like that. So the only thing that he had was, "Thank you for your service," and I took that away from him. But because he had to double down then, because he wasn't going to be the guy that didn't support the troops. And so he said something that was completely illogical. So I could not agree more with Mr. Bolton that we are suffering from a case of national cognitive dissonance when it comes to thank you for your service.
Yep, go ahead.
Jump in real quickly on the readiness issue. Something you alluded to, Larry. The most pernicious effect of that, to me, in a lot of ways, is not tangible. It's not about airframes getting worn out. It's not about readiness rates of equipment or even some of the other numbers. It's about what it does ethically to the institution. Depending, especially at the height of a war, when everybody's got to give a thumbs up, even a smaller scale war like Iraq or Afghanistan, the military and especially the officer corps gets incentivized to lie, to compromise its own ethics and its own integrity in order to say we're ready to go or say we can do X, Y, and Z. You see it across the board. I mean, the DERS system, which you alluded to, is usually a stoplight. You're green on something, you're yellow on it, or you're red, and it's usually tactical tasks. We can do X, Y, or Z. We're green, yellow, or red. Can we do an opposed river crossing, which is a pretty dangerous, difficult, complicated maneuver? Well, we had some guys that studied that in school 6 years ago. We're green. It's farcical when you encounter it on a day-to-day basis sometimes. So what that does long-term, and that's a long-term pernicious thing. When you have guys that grow up as lieutenants and captains, coming up, most of us got out as junior officers, and you're exposed to that, and that's the expectation in a lot of places. Sometimes you get some folks with the willingness and the strength to resist that. Most of them are not going to be generals because they're doing that. When you grow up with that, by the time you're a major, lieutenant colonel, or even a general, and hopefully you're calling the shots and able to make decisions, you've been acculturated into a system where pleasing the boss, compromising your integrity and your ethics in order to get the job done, where that's the expectation. There's a good, for you, those of you that are interested, and it's not super long, it's a good monograph the Army War College put out. I think the author's name is Leonard Wong. And I think it's called Lying to Ourselves, right? Wasn't that the name of it? A couple of years ago. That's worth, you can find that on Google, and it's worth reading.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, there was an article, I'm sorry, in the news the last couple of days, report about that there was a congressional committee or a group that had come out and said, we have a major readiness crisis. And they went and they detailed a lot of things in there, and it actually made a lot of the news, and everybody's like, oh my goodness. And you look at one of the recommendations, and what a shock, we need to increase defense spending. And you look through the whole thing, and I did, and it doesn't say anything in there about the fact that we've been rode hard and put up with, as was said a minute ago. Look, if there's a readiness crisis, the vast majority of that is because we're spending ourselves, as Senator Paul said a minute ago, on 17 wars around the globe. Things that don't even matter to our national security. I mean, we've been all through the surge in Iraq, all through the surge in Afghanistan. We still are in both places. We've now added all these other ones to it. All of these things are fighting on things that don't even affect our national security. You want to fix readiness? What you need to do is stop spending $45 billion a year in Afghanistan and start, as many have said, using that somewhere else, or just not even sending them out there. Because one of the lesser real problems in that I've not seen mentioned anywhere in public is that when you spend so much time training on counterinsurgency warfare, it is a zero-sum deal on what you trained. And when you focus your mind on going out and taking tanks out to pacify a village, that means you're not taking training to use those tanks to fight other tanks or things that might one day actually be an existential fight. And we have really lost, I'm a former Armored Cav guy, and I've seen firsthand the difference of what happens when you train like crazy, like Doug McGregor did for us in Desert Storm. I mean, he prepared us to be able to win any fight anywhere. Well, now then, that's no longer the case because all of your training is diverted in like 5 or 6 or 8 different areas, and sometimes you go years without, and I'm talking armored troops, may go years without doing any maneuver training. And that's the bigger maneuver or readiness problem than just the amount of money.
Well, that is a real problem. After I came back from Iraq, I went back to the schoolhouse and I worked as an instructor for a couple years. And then when I came back to the fleet and I took command of a tank company, I had a tank company full of tankers who had never spent any time on a tank. We went to gunnery for the first time, and I realized I hadn't been on a tank in about 4.5 years at that point, and I realized that I had vastly more experience on a tank than any of my enlisted crewmen did. And so we had to spend months just preparing to execute a simple, basic gunnery package. And as far as that report goes, I read through the whole thing too, and it was classic Washington. A blue ribbon panel makes the recommendation, that makes the politically unpopular recommendations, so the elected officials can hold this up and say, look, this is why we have to raise taxes, this is why we have to raise military spending. Classic Washington right there. It also, there's also the issue of threat inflation, but even more importantly, this is the logical fallacy of that report. It's saying that the United States is losing its technological edge against Russia and China, when if you look at it, Russia and China spends a fraction that we do on the military, yet they're gaining on us somehow. But the only possible solution that we have is to increase resources to the Pentagon. That does not make any sense whatsoever. If you just take a look at like basic logic, that it fails at every level on that one. Obviously, if we're spending 2 to 3 times more than we are than Russia or China is, our problem is not a resource problem. We need to really figure out how we're spending our money and make sure that we're making better decisions so that if we are losing our technological advantage, we can try to replicate what they're doing at a fraction of the cost.
Just a note on readiness. I'm an Apache pilot, and I have about 3 deployments as an Apache pilot and about 2,000 hours. I have never flown an aircraft with less than 4,000 hours on it, and I've flown quite a few with more than 10,000 hours on them, which in the helicopter world is unheard of. And then with regard to our equipment is worn, but the career people who have stayed in, they're tired, and I can't express how tired. I made the mistake of having some free time, and I built a spreadsheet, and I calculated how much time I'd been away, TDY, deployment, since I've been married. I've been married for 9 years. I've been gone 35% of my marriage. And that's not to feel sorry for myself, but that is not uncommon, especially among the field grade officer types. And that's not healthy because A, it's destroying military families who already sacrifice enough. And 2, that op tempo doesn't allow time for a professional officer corps to actually educate themselves in things like strategy aside from the day-to-day. And it becomes quite problematic when you have an officer corps who is so focused on doing rather than thinking.
Thanks. Well, you've got a rich tapestry up here of experience. We've only barely tapped it. What are your questions? Please. Yeah.
Up front here.
Up here, up front, right here.
My name is Richard Squires. I keep hearing that our incursions into the Middle East are all fails, are all failures, and that the wars that we're fighting there are unwinnable. And yet, it seems to me from another perspective, if as the architect of these wars, your objective was not to win the war, but rather reduce the people that you see as your enemies to failed states of warring factions, that in fact, if you're talking about Iraq or Libya or Syria, we've actually been quite successful. And that if the objective is to keep Saudi Arabia and Israel safe from their enemies by reducing them to failed states, this hasn't been a bad deal at all. Could you speak to that, please?
I'd love to.
Let me just make one remark, moderator privilege here. I'd want to say, how's that really working out for you? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I could not disagree more. We have not succeeded in doing anything except for create even more instability. I mean, look what, before 9/11, we had Saddam, I'm sorry, before 2003, we had Saddam Hussein in power, and he was contained in there. There was no terrorism coming out, or very, very minor. Now it's like one of the big hotbeds of there. And we've lost, I don't know, what, 50,000 killed and wounded Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed in that area. And in Afghanistan, it's in the tens of thousands of people killed. And now then, there are 20 known terrorist groups operating out of there, where there was maybe one or two prior to 9/11. So everywhere we've gone, the threat has exploded, the cost has increased, and our security has gone down, because now then we have to face even more terror operations later on. Well, I'll just flat tell you that it's not in America's policy to use our troops and our money to defend other nations. And I think that Saudi Arabia will do fine. If we're not out there, they will find ways to accommodate. They'll fight less in areas where they don't think they can win. But by our support all the time, that's why we're still in Yemen, in my opinion, is because they know that we've got their backs and we're also supporting them. If they didn't have that, then they would have to come to an accommodation, as they've done through thousands of years, before we were ever in the area. So our presence there is not necessary to keep it safe. And in fact, we're not keeping it safe. We're keeping things turned up, which is not helping us or them.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well. Even if I'm not sure I buy some of the assertion you're making, but the security of both Israel and Saudi Arabia has not been helped by the failed states on their borders. The Saudis went into Yemen, which was a problem, was a problem that could have been dealt with in a bunch of ways, and the foreign minister who died just before the war kicked off had pushed against it. That failed state on the Saudi border is now lobbing missiles at Riyadh, which is exponentially worse than any of the problems they were dealing with before deciding to go in there. The Israelis, we could unpack that as far as who was advocating for the Iraq War and who wasn't, but the failed or fractured state of Iraq now, the Israelis, despite getting some kind of basic conventional security from the Iraqi army being hauled out and destroyed and now rebuilt, there's now a land bridge that Iran has through Iraq, through Syria, through Lebanon, that now threatens Israel in terms of the missile issue. So I'm not sure this has worked out really well for any of our, allies, give or take, in the region.
The strategy that I heard briefed in the Pentagon in 2001 and 2002 was, very simply put, to create chaos in the region so that Israel's security would be assured. That is to say, to have Arabs fighting Arabs, Arab states failing, and ultimately Arabs fighting Persians and vice versa. And that would secure Israel. That is tantamount to strategic idiocy. And yet, that is part of the strategy that your country has been pursuing, particularly under the influence of a group called the neoconservatives. What it has done is produced this morning, last night, the resignation of Avigdor Lieberman, the Russian immigrant, 1 million new Israelis, supporter of Bibi Netanyahu. So in the next few hours, days, we might see some of the impact of this beginning to unravel for the Israelis. This is not in their long-term security interest, just like their apartheid state on the West Bank is not in their long-term security interest, just like the alt-right Greater Zionist movement sponsored by Lieberman and Netanyahu is not in their long-term interest. And we are playing right into that to our imminent peril.
My name is Fred Bonek. I'm from the Daily Ripple. I'm a Gold Star dad. I also have a son who is a Marine, a son who is in the Army, a daughter in the Navy, and my son who worked with JSOC in the Air Force. He died in 2010 in Afghanistan under Colonel Wesley Rior. So, Mike, first I want to thank you, not for your service, but for the most amazing conversation that you've had here that I've never heard any people from the service ever say. One lesson I learned in life is it's never best to mop up the floor with the water coming out of the light in the ceiling. It's best to go up to the bathroom and shut the water off. how do we shut the water off? Who do we talk to? I mean, is it, taking on super hawks like Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham? I mean, I've already done both that. So how do we stop this water from flowing down through the light that we keep mopping up down below?
I would just say skin in the game. If they tax the American people for the bombs that we're dropping, is gas $8 a gallon for the 26,171 bombs we dropped in 2016? No. Like, is there any hurt put on the American people for the wars? Nothing. So I think if the only thing they did was tie the conduct of war to everyone in the country, be it taxes or draft or some other way, then they would end. And you can't put it on a credit card anymore. That's the one way that it would stop. But because people before have already said there's zero connection anymore between the cost of war and the conduct of war, which is unprecedented in American history. So that's my 2 cents, skin in the game. Yeah.
You do, and I agree with that comment entirely. We have put it out at the forum, for example, that if you had a commensurate per capita tax for the wars that have now cost, some estimate, $3 to $5 trillion, and you had the sons and daughters of congressmen and corporate leaders out on the edge of that battle, how long do you think these wars would continue?
Yeah, and things like this forum, number one, is a good opportunity because we're actually getting it out there, on Capitol Hill, with lots of people seeing it, listening to it, you doing what you've been doing, which I appreciate your service as much as anything else, and my condolences to your loss, which we all feel is a personal situation, I'm sure. But the other thing that I think is we just have to, I guess, do everything within our individual powers to bring this out. John Henry from a group here in town, the Committee for the Republic, had a great idea, which is kind of similar to what you were talking about there, which was, hey, let's ask the president or any number of members of Congress to say, hey, let's put all of these 17 military conflicts up for a vote. If anybody thinks that they are in America's interest, then by all means, let's continue doing so because we don't want to put our security at risk at all. Anything that doesn't pass that muster gets shut down. And I guarantee you, if you put that out there and the American people, through their representatives, got a chance to see, just what was going on, and then they could make their own decisions about, well, this is valid, this is not, yeah, I think ours is here, then it would be a lot less because they would actually know. But as it is, of course, that won't come. We didn't even get the vote yesterday come to a vote on something that was really minor. So we certainly aren't going to get that unless people start demanding it of them. So that actually whatever our military does actually is in our national security and our national defense, and our money isn't wasted, and our sons and daughters don't lose their lives for no reason.
Thank you.
One in the back.
George Liebman from the Calvert Institute in Baltimore. I wonder if you might comment on the problems caused by repeated military deployments in combat zones of the same people. My appreciation of this, I think, was enhanced somewhat. I own a place that's in close proximity to the Veterans Psychiatric Hospital in Perry Point, Maryland. And the commandant of that hospital not long ago put out on the lawn of the gatehouse 650 small American flags. And I was curious about what these represented, and I looked at the sign he caused to be erected, and these flags each represented one veteran suicide in the previous month. They're running at a rate of about 8,000 a year. And one of the reasons for this, I believe, is the practice of redeploying the same people into theaters of war 7, 8, 9 times, at the end of which they are the walking wounded forever. And perhaps one strategy from a political point of view is to ask for a commission on military manpower and deployment, not to seek a revival of the draft, but simply to dramatize how much of the burden is being borne by a very small number of people. And that is further enhanced by the fact that the military rejects 3/4 of the people who try to enter it because they're either obese, drug addicted, or have other causes. And this would focus attention on something that does contribute to potential military weakness and does call for a redeployment of priorities to addressing that population and rendering it less unfit. That's a large question, but I
Thank you.
think it's one that should be asked.
Comments? Please.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. One, not to make light of veteran suicide, but statistically, it's not terribly different. The problem is the stress of deployment and in the military in general is starting to bear a heavier burden on the average recruit than it is on previous generations. So you alluded to recruitment. So 1/4 of American men, 18 to 25, are actually fit for recruitment. And that's a societal problem. That's not really for this panel. And that bears into that issue. On average, the suicide rates for returning deployers are less than for the military as a whole. So that I think is not understood because you have this abstract military. And you're either a hero or you're a PTSD veteran. That's what it amounts to. And it's a terrible stereotyping of individuals who have unique concerns, histories, experiences, et cetera. And only in a country where there's such a huge, almost insurmountable gap between its all-volunteer force and the citizenry could you possibly have such nonsensical stereotyping. I think it leads into a lack of scrutiny. So people in the military are objectively proud of, we're so trusted. And that's great. But one of the reasons we're so trusted is because nobody understands anything. And that is what it is. So, people, Congress has low approval ratings. The government as a whole has relatively low approval ratings. Well, that's because they see it every day. And I would like more scrutiny of our military. There was the church is made fun of, but a respected, venerable institution. The government is made fun of, but a respectable, venerable institution. The military is not, because nobody understands it. So it becomes this cudgel, which the right uses to hammer people, and the left is afraid to bring up, in terms of both budgets and politics. So really quick anecdote, there's a funny video of a conference at Harvard in the 1950s, and this guy is singing a song, and he's basically accusing his drill sergeants of being criminals, and all his draftee friends were criminals. And the audience is laughing, because A, it's funny, B, they understood it because a third of them were either World War II, Korean, or just draftee veterans. There was this commonality that existed. Now, A, that would never be played at Harvard, and B, if it were, nobody would understand because no one has that common reference because there is 1%. So there's this huge disconnect between the citizenry and the military enables that disconnect, it enables that poor decision-making and that stereotyping of people. With regard to deployments, deployments come with the military, TDY trips come with the military. But if it's worth the win, it's not, people understand that's what they signed up for. The problem is, it's not. And it's immoral to put people into situations telling them they should win when you know they can't. And that's the problem with repetitive deployments. They're immoral because they're not in service of the nation's good.
Thank you.
If I can jump in real quickly. Sir, one thing you alluded to as well, something we ought to talk about briefly, the burden is not shared even within the military, right? By no means. It is a very small group of people that are being sent back over and over again, especially in the most highly trained and the most skilled units. I mean, we've got, I think off the top of my head, the tooth-to-tail ratio is 1 to 8, and it's probably worse than that. But once you start dialing down to, and this ties into something Dan was saying about having a tank platoon trying to pacify a village, once you dial down to the really high end, the Joint Special Operations Command and the broader Special Operations Command units, and even your line infantry in the Army and Marines, it's not that many guys. It really isn't. And good way to look at this, you look at the trickle of casualties we've had, especially outside Afghanistan, especially Iraq and Syria. Look at the bios of some of those guys sometimes. You'll see guys from places like Delta, from the Ranger Regiment. Some of these guys, especially if they're senior staff NCOs, are going to have 8, 10, 12 deployments in some cases, or up in that number. Now these are shorter 3-4 month deployments. These are incredibly intense night raids on a daily basis, sometimes kind of deployments. So those folks are getting worked and worked to the bone. The Army, I think, is short of 50 ODAs right now for Special Forces. The Niger incident, which I think probably most of you in the room are tracking on, and that investigation just came out recently. When they broke that down, one of the biggest issues, according to the Army anyway, that unit had was that they hadn't had time to adequately train to go over to what was supposedly a peacetime training mission in Niger. They didn't have enough time in the States to prepare adequately for what came to them because the tempo is so high, especially for those kinds of units. So that the burden sharing is not just a societal issue, but even inside the military itself.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. We have just barely tapped a wealth of debate and discussion that should be going on amongst the American people and certainly amongst their representatives on the Hill. So I would just offer to you anything that you can do to spark that debate, to encourage that debate and that discussion would be, I think, positive for the country. Let's thank the panel, please.
Thank you. And we're going to take a 15-minute break for lunch. Lunch is in boxes over there, and then we'll start our media panel promptly at 12 p.m.